In the center of a shadowy palace, a severed head floats in mid-air. Blood falls from its neck. A brilliant halo surrounds its face, and directly before it stands a nearly naked young woman, frozen with one arm extended as though she has just summoned the vision herself. This is The Apparition, painted by Gustave Moreau in the 19th century. It depicts Salome confronting the head of St. John the Baptist. But the painting does not show the biblical story as it was traditionally told. There is no silver platter, no clear moment of execution, only a supernatural confrontation that seems to exist somewhere between prophecy, memory, and hallucination. Is Salome seeing the future before John is killed? Is she being haunted by remorse after demanding his death? Or is the floating head visible only inside her mind? Even more disturbing is the atmosphere surrounding its creation. Moreau lived in a Paris where artists experimented with dreams, mysticism, and altered states of consciousness, and where opium was believed to open doors into hidden realities. Some critics would later claim that this impossible scene was born from hallucination. That accusation was never proven, yet it has followed the painting for centuries. So what are we truly looking at? A biblical warning, the birth of a guilty conscience, or the private nightmare of an artist obsessed with beauty, death, and the supernatural? To understand why this painting remains so difficult to solve, we must first enter the strange world of 19th century Paris, where art, dreams, and opium began to blur into one another. In late 19th century Paris, opium was more than a private vice. For some artists and writers, it became a method of exploration, a way to escape ordinary perception and enter a world of intensified dreams, distorted images, and unfamiliar sensations. It was commonly consumed as laudanum, a mixture of opium and alcohol, or smoked in pipes inside private salons and opium dens. The effects could include deep relaxation, euphoria, and vivid hallucinations. To artists searching for realities beyond the visible world, these experiences seem to offer access to the subconscious. The writer Théophile Gautier described psychoactive substances as doors to altered states of consciousness, where sounds, colors, and images gained unusual intensity. The symbolist artist Odilon Redon created similarly unstable worlds filled with floating eyes, monstrous forms, dreams, and nightmares. Gustave Moreau belonged to this same cultural atmosphere. There is no reliable evidence proving that he regularly used opium, but his paintings repeatedly explore visions, trance-like states, religious ecstasy, and supernatural encounters. His interest was not in painting everyday life. He wanted to make the invisible visible. That is why The Apparition feels less like a historical scene and more like an image projected from the mind. The palace does not behave like a real space. The figures seem suspended in time, and the severed head appears not as a physical object, but as a revelation. But before we can understand what Salome may be seeing, we need to understand the crime that brought this vision into existence. For Gustave Moreau, Salome was not a subject he painted once and abandoned. She became an obsession. Across his career, he produced more than 150 drawings and around 25 paintings connected to the story of Salome and Herod. He also created at least 8 closely related versions of The Apparition. This repetition suggests that Moreau was not simply illustrating a biblical episode. He was repeatedly returning to the same psychological conflict: beauty confronting death, desire producing violence, and a young woman suddenly faced with the consequence of her own request. Moreau first presented a watercolor version of this theme at the Paris Salon of 1876, where it immediately caused a sensation. Viewers were familiar with the story of John the Baptist, but they were not prepared for this interpretation. Instead of showing the head resting on a plate, Moreau transformed it into a radiant, floating vision. Salome is often described as a femme fatale, a woman whose beauty leads men toward destruction. But Moreau's version is more complicated. She appears seductive, but not completely triumphant. Her body is decorated like an idol, while her face seems caught between fascination, shock, and fear. This ambiguity is essential. Moreau does not tell us whether Salome is evil, manipulated, guilty, or terrified. He allows all of these possibilities to exist at once, and that uncertainty is what makes the painting psychologically disturbing. To understand how she reached this moment, we must return to the birthday feast, where one dance became a death sentence. The story begins with Herod Antipas, ruler of Galilee, and his wife Herodias. Their marriage was controversial because Herodias had previously been married to Herod's half-brother. John the Baptist publicly condemned the union, calling it unlawful. Herodias wanted John dead. Herod, however, hesitated. He feared John's influence and recognized him as a righteous and holy man. So instead of killing him, he had him imprisoned. Then came Herod's birthday banquet. Before the ruler and his guests, Salome performed a dance so captivating that Herod made a reckless promise. She could ask for anything she desired, even half of his kingdom. Salome turned to her mother for guidance. Herodias did not ask for wealth, land, or power. She demanded revenge. She told her daughter to request the head of John the Baptist on a platter. The request horrified Herod, but he had made his promise publicly in front of his guests. Refusing Salome would expose his weakness and dishonor his word. So the king chose reputation over conscience. John was executed inside the prison. His head was placed on a platter and delivered to Salome, who then gave it to her mother. A dance that began as entertainment had ended in murder. For centuries, artists depicted this moment literally. Salome holding the platter, the executioner nearby, and John's lifeless head displayed as proof of the crime. Moreau chose something far more unsettling. He removed the plate and transformed the head into a supernatural presence. That single decision changes the entire story. The head is no longer merely Salome's reward. It becomes an accusation. Moreau places the confrontation between Salome and John's head at the exact center of the painting. Everything else, the throne, the executioner, the palace, even the other figures, seems to withdraw into the shadows. On the left, Herod sits motionless on his throne, his body almost cadaverous. Herodias stands nearby. On the right, the executioner still holds the bloody sword used to kill John. But none of them reacts with the same intensity as Salome. The surrounding figures appear frozen, as though time has stopped. Salome, who has just completed her dance, is also suddenly still. One arm points toward the head, while her face seems caught between fascination, shock, and fear. Her body is almost naked but covered with elaborate jewelry and ornaments. She appears less like an ordinary woman than a sacred idol, beautiful, remote, and dangerous. The Black Panther at her feet strengthens the sense of controlled violence, as though something predatory has been waiting beneath the spectacle all along. The floor is scattered with flowers, symbols of beauty and celebration. But blood falls from John's neck onto the same surface. Moreau forces beauty and horror to occupy the same space. The flowers do not soften the violence, they make it more disturbing. The palace itself is equally unstable. Moreau combined architectural and decorative elements from Byzantine, Romanesque, Phoenician, Buddhist, and Islamic traditions. Some scholars have linked the setting to the Alhambra in Granada. The result is not a historically accurate palace, but an imaginary one assembled from multiple cultures and eras. Moreau intensified this uncertainty through a scraping technique known as grattage. By removing parts of the paint, he created a rough, unfocused surface. Details seem to appear and disappear, making the palace feel less like solid architecture and more like a vision struggling to remain visible. And then there is John's head. It does not simply float, it radiates. Encircled by a bright halo, it becomes the clearest and most powerful presence in the room. Although John has been physically destroyed, he now appears spiritually dominant. The image also recalls famous representations of Medusa, a severed head whose gaze carries supernatural power. That connection transforms John from a passive victim into a terrifying vision capable of confronting Salome even after death. But the most important detail remains unresolved. Is this head physically present, or has Salome's own mind created it? The power of the apparition comes from the fact that Moreau refuses to tell us exactly what is happening. The painting does not correspond to one precise verse in the biblical story. Instead, it appears to combine several moments into a single vision. One possibility is that John has not yet been executed. Salome may be seeing the future at the end of her dance. A supernatural warning revealing the consequence of the request she is about to make. If this is true, the floating head becomes a prophecy. Salome is being shown the murder before it happens, but the painting never tells us whether she will turn away or continue toward it. A second interpretation is even darker. John is already dead, and the apparition is the first sign of Salome's remorse. The head has returned not as a trophy, but as a memory she cannot escape. Her expression supports this possibility. She does not appear pleased. She seems startled, almost afraid, as though the reality of her request has only now become clear. There is also a third possibility. The head is not a vision of the future or a memory of the past. It may be a symbol of judgment. Although John has been silenced physically, his spiritual presence has become stronger than everyone else in the palace. This raises another unresolved question. Who can see the apparition? Is Salome alone in confronting it, while Herod, Herodias, and the executioner remain trapped in ordinary reality? Or has the entire room witnessed the same supernatural event? Moreau leaves every possibility open, and because no single interpretation fully explains the scene, the viewer is forced to complete the painting with their own fears, beliefs, and sense of guilt. But this uncertainty also gave rise to the painting's most controversial theory, that the vision did not come from Salome at all, but from Moreau himself. When the apparition appeared in the 19th century, some critics struggled to explain its dreamlike logic. The floating head, unstable architecture, and mixture of sensuality with religious terror seemed so unnatural that they accused Moreau of painting under the influence of opium. But no reliable evidence proves that Moreau regularly consumed the drug. The accusation may reveal more about the critics than about the artist. Faced with an image that rejected ordinary reality, they searched for a physical explanation. Moreau's working process also complicates the theory. The apparition was not produced in a single uncontrolled burst. He studied the subject for years, created numerous drawings, and painted several related versions. Every jewel, gesture, architectural detail, and symbol appears carefully constructed. Yet the opium theory cannot be dismissed entirely as meaningless. Even without proof that Moreau used it, he lived in a culture fascinated by altered consciousness. Artists and writers were exploring dreams, hallucinations, mysticism, and the hidden regions of the mind. Moreau may not have needed opium to create a hallucination. His art was already designed to imitate one. He assembled fragments of religion, mythology, architecture, eroticism, and death until reality itself began to feel unstable. Perhaps that is why the painting never allows us to decide whether we are witnessing a miracle, a guilty memory, a prophecy, or a nightmare. And more than a century later, that uncertainty remains the true apparition, one that continues to appear differently inside the mind of every viewer. The apparition does not survive because it gives us a clear answer. It survives because every answer creates another question. Salome may be witnessing the future, confronting her guilt, or standing before a divine judgment. The floating head may be a prophecy, a memory, or nothing more than an image formed inside a terrified mind. Moreau never chose for us. Instead, he transformed a familiar biblical murder into a psychological mystery, one where beauty, desire, violence, and remorse can no longer be separated. So what do you believe Salome is truly seeing? The consequence of a crime that has already happened, a warning of what she is about to do, or a hallucination created by Moreau's own imagination? Share your interpretation in the comments, because perhaps the final meaning of the apparition does not belong to the artist at all. Perhaps it belongs to the person standing before it.